Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to a new session of Islamic Perspectives with myself, al-Azami, and I'm really delighted to have two wonderful scholars who are going to talk about their book, their recently co-authored book. I have with me Dr. Walaa Quisay, beaming in from North America, actually, and Dr. Asim Qureshi from good old London, from old Blighty, shall we say, and representing sort of two really brilliant scholarly insights into a very painful and challenging subject, but one which needs to be looked at very squarely in the eye in this moment, in a sense, two and something decades into the official inauguration of the so-called War on Terror, which has been a period of trauma in many respects for Muslims globally. But at the same time, as we are talking about this in Ramadan, I want us to perhaps reflect on how this could be a period of spiritual growth. Dr. Walaa Quisay is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at Edinburgh University. Dr. Asim Qureshi is, of course, the Research Director at CAGE, which has recently been given a shout-out in Parliament, and therefore, under parliamentary privilege, we can't take to task the person who has been bad-mouthing the institute, the wonderful institution, important institution of CAGE. But inshallah, we will have opportunities to have our day in court, as it were, to defend what the rights of Muslims. And this is something which is particularly close to our hearts over the course of the last 5 months, where we've seen this horrendous onslaught against our Muslim brothers and sisters in Gaza. Today's book is entitled "When Only God Can See: The Faith of Muslim Political Prisoners." And it's about, what it's about is something which Dr. Walaa will be introducing in the course of the next 10 to 15 minutes, though you're allowed to, if you want, you can take a longer period with that. But it's also going to be a deep and powerful insight for anyone who reads it, and I've been reading it for the last couple of weeks, into the psyche and the challenges faced by Muslim prisoners of the War on Terror across the globe. And this is, of course, a global phenomenon. And those of us who have a certain amount of agency living in parts of the world where there are greater freedoms than what many of our brothers and sisters do not enjoy in places like Egypt or currently in Gaza, we have a special responsibility, I think, this Ramadan to reflect on what our duties are towards our brothers and sisters globally, towards the Ummah, and as Muslims before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. With that, I didn't mean to have such an elaborate introduction, but I think it was deserving for the subject matter of your book. I want to hand over to Dr. Walaa Quisay to talk about this book, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Osama. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So I want to start our conversation about the book with the foreword. I think it best encapsulates what the book intends to do. The foreword was co-written by two former detainees, Omar and Layla. They were taken as children. Layla was first incarcerated at 13 and Omar at 15. Layla being in Egypt and Omar incarcerated in Guantanamo. And they relay their narratives and struggles and the very particular things that come up to them when they reflect on their time in prison. I think Layla noted something that was very, very interesting she noted the question of culpability. The guards would say, you are like my daughter. I'm only doing what I'm ordered to do. This is just a job. And she would look at him with a mix of pity and she would say, well, then resign. And I think this encapsulates different levels of responsibility amidst what's going on. When we first thought about writing this book, we found that the stories we'd encountered were unique, but there was some sort of through line throughout these whole narratives of prisoners in Egypt and Guantanamo. And it was no surprise that Egypt and Guantanamo became the central focus of our work. It is not just the fact that we're both working on these topics, but there is a lot of commonalities in terms of the strategies used by the prison authorities. And you can see it reflect in the very carceral technologies and the information or the intelligence sharing between the Egyptian regime and the US. And this has been a historical ongoing. I think in the initial period, or in the introduction of the book, we tried to stress that when we talk about the war on terror, we don't locate the beginning of the war on terror in 2001. The war on terror is exemplified by a rule through exception. And there are different histories and there are different technologies that led us to the point of 2001. And that's something that's very, very important to note. So we found a lot of similarities in terms of how the prison infrastructure organized itself and how the officers responded to the, the careers, basically. But there are also some stark differences that we found to have made this a very, very rich topic. The first and most stark difference, I think, that was highlighted first in the foreword but throughout the book, is that we tried to compare and contrast the experiences of Muslims under the carceral control of an ostensibly non-Muslim prison organization. So how did the guards and the prison infrastructure in Guantanamo deal with Muslim prisoners as people that are foreign to them and not as co-religionists, versus how did Muslims incarcerated by other Muslims relate to their experiences? And there are moments of intrigue. There are really, really violent moments. You can see in the chapter on torture where the prison authorities in Guantanamo, for example, shaved crosses on the heads of the prisoners as a way to humiliate them, but also with a keen and almost mystical belief that somehow the people, because they have crosses, will somehow combust, because this is something that is unnatural. So their misunderstanding, their essentialization of Muslim experiences, plus the rituals of humiliation. On the Egyptian side, there is this other keen feeling or understanding that, well, we practice the same faith. So how do you square this, right? And so we found really, really interesting things in terms of how the prison authorities felt like they were themselves involved in a religious war against the prisoners. So they were conducting this war against these people in the cells, or how how officers would somehow cringe or would feel a sense of outrage at the possibility that the prisoner would make dua against them. So that's something that we found to be a point that would be interesting to highlight. The other thing that was interesting for me is the issue of gender. Now, the Guantanamo facility only held male prisoners, but there were female prison guards that were in charge and administered torture and sexual violence, versus the Egyptian case where the prisoners were both male and female, and how different genders from how the prison authorities that were both male and female interacted with the with the prison population differently. There are so many differences, but we found that there was an interesting logic that tied these experiences in their raw format together. But we wanted to tell a story. We wanted to tell narratives. And it was precisely because we saw the narratives of prisoners being positioned in three distinct ways. There's the story that the state tells. It's the story of criminality and fear. this story shows how society at large is held hostage, in a sense, to these vulnerable individuals. So it's a narrative of terror, basically. And through this narrative of terror, you have the security war on terror experts, the counterterrorism experts that produce knowledge on how best to sedate this prison population that, if let out, would somehow pose some existential threat to society at large. You have the story that the NGOs tell. And as well-meaning as that story may be, it tells us it it talks in terms of strategies, and it talks in terms of snapshot narratives with the aim of release, which is in itself a very, very important goal, right? But it's told in a particular way in order to give the state and state actors a route to redemption. And in doing so, it creates categories of perfect victims and imperfect victims. And with that, you have people who are leveraged, and a lot of emotional, intellectual, and basically advocacy leverage is placed upon them to act as perfect victims in order to, again, allow their narratives to be dissolved within society in a way that is easily digestible. And then lastly, there is the academic narrative. The academic narrative is either a security narrative, and again, I don't want to paint everyone in the same brush, but there is some sort of trajectories that are consistent. There is a radicalization narrative that consistently takes over, or there is an overemphasis on theorization and reification of the prisoner as a mere body to be experienced, to be told, to be theorized, to be limited. And this is not what we wanted to do. We wanted to bring out the narratives of people as they tell them. And so in that way, we try to act somewhat as storytellers and translators of an experience. And we try to focus, or we try to cushion this all in an understanding that prison, whether we acknowledge it or not, informs our reality. The carceral system, whether it's in Muslim majority countries or in the US and the UK, really casts a long shadow over Muslim political agency. And in turn, the invisible people within these prison systems really do relay all of our hidden stories. So the book kind of tracks the life cycle of detention and the salience of Islam in this life cycle of detention. We begin from the moment of capture all the way through strategies of resistance. In doing so, we examine key fiqhi questions such as prayer, ablution, jama'ah, and we think about how it relates to space, temporality, community making. We also examine the question of theodicy and suffering, especially with the notion of free will. How does one enact free will, if free will indeed is a part of our aqidah, if you are in a place where you are stripped of your agency? And this is a question prisoners constantly deal with. We think about human capacity, both for evil and to withstand such evil. We even look at questions of supernatural and how the ethereal displaces the very real structures of the carceral. And lastly, we look at resistance. So this is a very, very short summary of what this book hopes or intends to accomplish, and a kind of brief summary of what it hopes to do. Thank you, Sam.
Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much, Walaa, for this kind of, in some respects, a broad overview of a book, which is very difficult to summarize because it's so packed with vignettes. So much of this is, as you said, kind of the opportunity you're giving to the subjects of this book to tell their own stories. And I think you do that very powerfully, and very poignantly and very painfully at times, because the stories are stories of, in some cases, intense suffering, and in other instances, cases of remarkable patience. I mean, in almost all cases that I recall, and also, especially the stories that were coming from Egypt, because you give a lot of vignettes of Egyptian prisons, which has, I mean, I don't know, anecdotally, it seems to be the largest prison industrial complex in the Muslim world. Perhaps Syria actually is a competitor.
Yeah.
But with those two sort of states, ostensibly the jailers are Muslim as well, and you sort of tease out the complexity of that, but also the emptiness of the "I am following orders" excuse, and so that, this is something which I really want to just encourage everyone to try and get their hands on the book, and try and have a read of these vignettes. You kind of make a point in the introduction, as I recall, that you're not trying to make some massive theoretical intervention of any kinds. You are actually taking the opportunity of using your agency as authors to express the the perspectives of those who are imprisoned. Yet, I think even for academic sort of audiences, there are really subtle and rich theoretical insights to be had from reading something like this. And it's fascinating how suffering can also give rise to fruitful sort of scholarly and intellectual reflection. I want to perhaps shift over from sort of the overview to asking you a question. I don't know which of the two of you want to address this, but just thinking a little bit about the motivations to write this book and what you hope to achieve. You've given some sense of that, but yeah, maybe.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I can take that. Jazakallah khair. Bismillah wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah. Thank you, Osama. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Wa alaikum salam.
So I think the idea of this kind of percolated out of a specific event that I held with Asim Beg. I remember calling him up one day and I said, it's really interesting that we've never really thought specifically about kind of like the fiqh of Guantanamo. How did you guys manage your faith in your deen? Because I'd always heard him tell the story so many times, such a wonderful story of him being on the first rendition flight after he was captured, and being in this kind of daze of not knowing what's going on until the person, a Libyan brother who was also placed on that rendition flight, they're all hooded in this scenario. He kind of whispers to Muazzim, have you prayed? And Muazzim's like, we're in this like crazy situation, and I hadn't even thought of praying my salah. And this man is one of the vignettes we tell in the book. This man's actually concerned about the salah time, and at that moment, Muazzim describes how a guard hears them kind of whispering to one another and puts a knife to their neck and threatens to kill them if they speak again. But rather than just kind of submit to that, they actually continue and they pray the salah together in Jama'ah, in this kind of weird, like trussed up completely, hoods over their heads, ropes tied to this plane. It's an unbelievable situation, and that story always made me think, okay, what are the other ways in which we can learn something about how prisoners really fulfill that verse in the Quran, fattakullah mastata'tum, kind of be conscious of God as much as you're able, because that's really they're confined. But what happens when, which I think was a more profound question, when the system and the structure of the prison itself is designed to specifically harm you?
Yeah.
So it's one thing to kind of make accommodations and to figure out, okay, I'm a prisoner now, how do I maneuver around this? But it's a completely different thing when they have kind of an act of anthropology, understood what your faith is,
Right.
and how that faith can be instrumentalized to harm you. So if you think of, for example, the works of Raphael Patai and the Arab Mind in particular, which was used in the early years of the war on terror to help the CIA, the FBI, the Department of Defense understand, who these Arabs actually are. But what was that book? It was, other than just kind of a pathologizing of Muslim beliefs and behaviors, with the specific purpose of harming them. And so, originally when I first approached Walaa, it was quite an ambitious project. It was kind of to try and put together like Fiqh al-Masajin as a book. But as we discussed it, we were like, we didn't think that was the book for us to do. And we think it's still a necessary book. And inshallah, I hope that somebody, especially somebody from the scholarly world who reads our book, will think to themselves, okay, how can I now turn something like this into a manual that can help prisoners all over the world? How can we turn this information into something that can have a much larger impact, for those who are in need of it? And so what we did is that we decided, as Walaa described, to turn this into much more of a human story, to really pay tribute to the interviews that we've conducted over the years with different people, to try and center their experiences as a way of bringing out the aspect of faith in particular. And so part of my motivation, at least anyway, and I think it was Walaa's as well, was to think about the war on terror beyond torture as physical violence, and more as a spiritual violence as well. That the violence takes place in at manifold levels, and one of those levels is one that is directed towards the spirit itself. But of course, where there is resistance, that resistance isn't necessarily just taking place through the limbs or through the tongue, but it's taking place within the heart itself. And so when somebody's completely trussed up and they have no physical ability to move, the mere fact that they are making sajda with their eyes is such a remarkable thing. And we heard that so many times over the course of the interviews that we conducted. So, I think the reason why we also decided quite early on, because we'd had whole discussions about, well, how many jurisdictions do we take on? So initially wanted to bring Syria into the conversation. We wanted to bring in East Turkestan into the conversation, because they're all experiencing the same thing, but with slightly different flavors and with different structures and technologies of violence. And we thought that rather than going for so many different jurisdictions and not being able to really tackle them adequately enough within one book, that it was better that we limited ourselves to two. So the experiences of those under the custody of the US, whether it's in Guantanamo Bay or in the mainland in the US, and those under the custody of Egypt. And what that gave us was this kind of juxtaposition of a carceral state that is predominantly non-Muslim, and a carceral state that is predominantly Muslim, and how there are so many similarities in the way that they use religion specifically to target and harm Muslims, even though in the case of Egypt they are Muslims themselves. And so there are whole other questions that come out in relation to the layers of complicities and betrayals that take place. So that's kind of a summary of the thinking that went into the book.
Well, feel free to jump in if you want to add anything, but I was going to also kind of add a couple of questions in relation to what you've just said. So that's right.
There was one thing that actually did not make it to the book. It was an anecdote that one prisoner said when they were bound in Egypt, and the prisoner wanted to pray, so he asked the guard to somehow like loosen his the shackles just a little bit so he can pray or make wudu somehow. And then the guard said, "Do you not know that there is a thing in fiqh called faqid al-tahurain?" So so the guard knew what to do. He's like, "Do you not know your religion? You can pray. Calm down." So it's very, very rich. It's very, very fascinating the way that this sort of dynamic between the prison authorities and the prisoner sort of meet in terms of Islam. But also two things that I think were very, very central in our findings. It's firstly the idea that the prison somehow tries to displace the element of divinity in its total control, and the reliance on God is in a way, or isn't in a way, it's in effect saying that there's something beyond these walls. And this is where when only God can see really comes in. The idea that there's this structure that attempts to be everything in the life of a prisoner. It attempts to control your body. It attempts to control your spiritual life. You can't read the Quran at specific times. You can't pray in Jama'ah. You can't do Jum'ah. You can't do all of these things. And so it attempts to completely encapsulate everything that you are in your totality. And when prisoners sort of prostrate and find ways to pray in community, in a way, it kind of displaces this totalistic kind of control. So that's something that we found was very, very significant. And sometimes this isn't a metaphor. Sometimes it's very, very explicitly stated by the prison authorities that we here are God and you worship us. And again, when the prisoner refuses to worship these structures, that becomes a very, very radical move in of itself. And the other thing that I wanted to mention regarding the similarities in terms of Egypt and Guantanamo, and it's something that I found when I was working on hunger strikes in different contexts, not just in Egypt and in the US, but the role of the prison chaplain. The prison chaplain becomes very, very central in translating the authority of the carceral authority to the prisoner, of coercing the prisoner in one way or another, and sometimes being involved in torture and interrogating the prisoners.
Right. I mean, dark subject material, but incredibly important. Also, I mean, as you were both talking about this, just the way in which knowledge, and specifically religious and spiritual knowledge, is weaponized very deliberately, both in, you give the example of the prison guard making sort of blasphemous claims of, we are God in this context. And this sort of stuff I've heard of more in places like Egypt, ironically, or in places like Syria, or the deliberate weaponization, as I think Asim, you were mentioning about in Guantanamo Bay, or the deliberate separating out of people so that they can't pray in Jama'ah, for example, or subjecting them to certain types of restrictions that very specific. I mean, some of the stuff that you write about is quite painful to read, and sometimes you wish, because the people being imprisoned very often are very average Muslims. They're not ulama in the vast majority of cases, so they don't always know the sort of like forgiving fiqh aspects of this. So they might subject themselves to greater levels of difficulty, and may Allah reward them for their, for their intentions and their azima and their determination to follow the letter of the law. But at the same time, yeah, the weaponization of scholarship is particularly perverse, I think. You mentioned Rafael Patai, and it just reminded me, I think he was like an anthropologist in my department at Princeton. I'm a sort of legacy of that tradition of scholarship, in a sense, because I also studied in the same department where Bernard Lewis was based for I don't know how many decades. And so, but at the same time, you mentioned, the somewhat absurd sort of like scenario where the prison warden saying, don't you know about faqid al-tahura? Don't you know this obscure ruling in fiqh where someone who's not able to, do wudu? And, I also have explored in the context of the Arab revolutions in my own sort of work, certain figures like, the really terrible figure of Ali Gumu'a, who essentially is kind of like it's not clear whether he's the Azhar's man in the intelligence services, or the intelligence services man in the Azhar, and probably a bit of both. But he's also one of the most prominent public scholars in a place like Egypt. And so it really is kind of, deeply troubling that things which so transparently would seem to be like quite so obviously acts of greatest dhulm or the greatest blaspheming is somehow being underwritten by supposed scholars, as it were. And so I guess all of this is just a brief reflection on the way in which the three of us aspiring to be scholars are, in a sense, trying to hold up the mirror to our own profession to think about. And if you have any further reflections on that, please feel free to share them, inshallah.
Just to add to that point, I think Ali Gum'a's student, Osama al-Azhari, is the prison man in Egypt, but not just in Egypt. He led a group of scholars to visit China, I think last year, and see the camps, and stated, that they were fighting terrorism. And so even not just within the actual physical technologies of torture, scholars do move from one repressive state to another, giving advice on how best to rehabilitate Muslim prisoners. He's heavily involved in chaplaincy work in Egypt, and when the vast majority of the prison complexes were destroyed in Egypt recently, and the mega prison complex, Badr complex, was erected, that's sort of modeled on the US prison system. Yeah. He was one of the people that was involved in the advertisement for this new rehabilitation center. So there is a religious discourse that's heavily embedded within these structures.
And I mean, in a sense, the global war on terror industrial complex is transnational. It's situated within sort of sovereign states, and that's kind of the grammar or the logic of these discourses. But in some respects, you're familiar, both of you, with the work of Ummatics. Some of you, I think both of you have spoken at the Ummatics colloquium. But yeah, in some respects, I seem to constantly come back to this idea that the nation state as a sort of operating unit of the international system is quite integral to the main tenets of the global war on terror. And I don't necessarily have any particular sort of response to what we should do about that, but because it's the most powerful norm, arguably, of the international system. But yeah, it's quite challenging to see all of these nation states coming together with the target of, in some respects, suppressing the ummah and its ummatic sort of aspirations. I'm sure we'll be talking on elements of this going forward. I wanted to maybe move on to a slightly different question, which is a bit more sort of straightforward. Why should people read this book? What would you say? Why do you feel maybe some people should be obligated to read this sort of a book?
So I think there are multiple audiences for this book. I think you're going to get out of it what you come into it with, really, as a person, as an individual, with your own subjectivity. For me, I hope that this book gets sent to prisoners all over the world, inshallah, especially Muslim prisoners. I hope it gets smuggled into them where it can be smuggled, inshallah. I think that it has importance and valence for Muslim audiences, of course, because we're talking about our faith here and the way that people within this ummah who are suffering extreme ends of violence, how they are practicing their faith. Because I think when you read a book like this, in some ways you can't help but read yourself into it. Especially when so many of the examples that we give are of the mundane. So, for example, Ali al-Marri, held in solitary confinement for over a decade on US soil at the Charleston Naval Brig. You know, he's somebody who was one of 3 enemy combatants. So all the enemy combatants are held outside of the US except for 3 men who are held directly on the US, and they're denied their constitutional rights. So we take for granted things like, for example, being ritually pure, and, you know, sorry for being graphic about this, but like plucking or shaving their hair that we're required to shave as Muslim men and women. And so you have these entire scenarios where, you know, as somebody who is observant and who wants to have a sense of cleanliness about himself, he is plucking himself by hand in order to be ritually pure. And you have these bizarre, you know, as, you know, kind of when Hannah Arendt describes the banality of evil, you have these logs of the prison guards that, you know, I sifted through, where they're literally describing watching him do this on the cameras as he's going through the pain of doing it. You know, you can't do much with a safety razor blade, but they're refusing him to give one because he's this kind of like extremely dangerous person that must be locked up without access to the Constitution and whatever else. But it gives you this kind of profound sense of how something that is so normal and so ordinary, and so, you know, physically and ritually purifying in our everyday lives becomes a site of extreme contestation for him as an individual who wants to maintain his both bodily and spiritual autonomy, and a prison system that knows and understands that this thing is hurting him and harming him, and they will do everything they can to maintain that, to the extent that they're willing to watch him do it and go through the pain of it. It's such a it's such an interesting thing to think about, and I think when you read moments like that, you can't help but read yourself into them. Like, you know, what does that mean for me? What does that mean about my own
What would I
kind of
have done in
relationship?
that situation?
What would I have done in that situation? And there are people who wouldn't have done that, and there are people who didn't do that as well. And I think that's part of the book as well, that there is no uniformity of experience. There are some people who will take a rukhsa, will take a mercy given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and there were some people who will be like, nope, absolutely not. And so even, for example, something as simple as the fiqhi issue of are you generic word for it, but are you a resident now of the prison? Yeah. It's so interesting because there were some people who were like, this is not my home. I have been kidnapped. I've been taken away from my family. So for 15, 16, 17 years, they prayed qasr and jam. They shortened their prayers and they combined their prayers. For what reason? As an act of resistance.
Right.
And there were some, usually Hanafis, no disrespect to Hanafis whatsoever, it's just their fiqh, who were like, nope, this is it. We're here now. We're going to pray exactly on time. We're not going to shorten. We're not going to combine. You know, this is how we're doing it. So it's really interesting that fiqh and those fiqh debates and discussions that we find, you know, in ISOC prayer rooms, were finding their way into like places like Guantanamo. But then you have other moments of like things that are genuinely, truly inspiring. Like Uzair Paracha telling us that he corrected his tajweed by reciting down the drain pipe of his cell because it was connected to a brother who had memorized the Quran. So he would recite, and then the brother would kind of correct his tajweed and correct his memorization. And, you know, in this process, they were trying their best to help him come attuned to the Quran, which is an incredible thing because, like, you know, how often do we get lazy and lax in our own memorization and recitation of it? So there are all these different elements in terms of like why Muslims, I think, would feel particularly interested in reading a book like this. I think it is so exceptional in terms of its circumstances of the way in which these people are being treated, but it is also so mundane in the things that become sites of contestation, right? The most basic thing, like going to the toilet, like undressing in front of another person, like reciting Quran, all of these things that are just so normal and regular become these massive moments for these men who are effectively in a conflict with their prison guards. And I think for non-Muslims who read this book, I think, one of the hopes that I had for it, at least, was that perhaps they'll get a better understanding of what the war on terror means outside of waterboarding is really bad, right? So because the discourse in America situates waterboarding as like the ultimate exceptional evil, and because there's so much focus on a torture technique like that, everything else fades into obscurity. So, for example, something like solitary confinement simply doesn't come onto the register of what an evil might look like, because waterboarding occupies almost 99% of the space of what is bad torture. So even something as simple as solitary confinement, which is torture, does not get given that same level of value. And so what this book does, I hope, inshallah, is help to inform people that something simple as having the Quran taken away from you can have a profound impact that is just as torturous as anything else. And we shouldn't have a sliding scale of what is torture and what isn't. These are all within the kind of the stratosphere of what we should be considering as targeted torture against Muslim prisoner populations.
Walaa, if you want to add anything, please don't hesitate.
Yeah. More to that, I mean, this is a big chunk of our history. This is a big chunk of the Muslim story. And this is a chunk that we never really had access to for many reasons, but also one that, again, we only chose to investigate through particular lens or another. Like, if you think of any sort of Muslim intellectual that existed in the 20th century, more likely than not, he would have or she would have gone through the experience of incarceration, and the carceral experience would have impacted the way they think about the world, the way that they relate to faith, the way that they relate to the Quran, the way that they relate to community, the way that they think of the state, the way that they think of their children. We can't really overstate how large the shadow of incarceration looms over us in Muslim majority countries, but also in the West. The carceral system is so expansive, and there is this weirdness of people made invisible, yet they're not invisible. Like the remnants of the carceral state is around us in such a significant and such a profound way, but the only stories we are allowed to tell, or we allow ourselves to tell, are either very, very abstracted stories of criminality, of fear, of just terror, or of feel-good resilience. And that's not the story. Is a lot more, it's a lot deeper, it's a lot more nuanced, and hopefully this will encourage other people to work on this topic in different contexts that they know more about. I'm really, really hoping that this is something that comes out of it. And you know what? In terms of Islam, it's very, very significant, but also it's intrinsically a part of the human story. I mean, one thing that I found really interesting when I was looking through the history of incarceration in Egypt is that in the 1980s, a very big chunk of the Coptic Church was imprisoned. Pope Shenouda was imprisoned in his monastery. A lot of priests were imprisoned. And they also tell stories of dreams. They also tell stories of spiritual resilience. And that's not to say that, everything is the same, but there is a big chunk of our human story that we don't really hear about, except through a very specific prism. And that's something that needs to change, basically.
And inshallah, this book is part of that story. Once again, just sort of underlining the importance of people reading this. I wanted to point out that there are actually more than 60 people in this who are watching.
Oh wow.
Really happy for you to be here. I also wanted to say that if you want to sort of put in comments or questions, you can do that in the chat in your respective sort of viewing platform. And we'll try to get to any questions that we can, inshallah. Just sort of going off of what you were just talking about, both of you actually, I mean, like, in a sense, we were talking about the sorts of debates that we have in ISOTs or anyone across the pond in MSA context, sort of the fiqh debates saying, oh, you know, can you pray in this way or can you pray in this context, etc. And I actually think that that's a sign of good health in a Muslim community, even if it's sometimes done in a unhealthy fashion by young Muslims. But you know, it's a sign of the seriousness with which they take their devotional practices. And in that sort of spirit, I want to say an additional way in which to read this book, which you've already kind of hinted at, Walaa, is this book can be read devotionally in the month of Ramadan in particular. I mean, it should, these sorts of things, learning about this should be recognized as learning about the Ummah's condition, and falls under the hadith of, you know, the sort of the Muslims are like a single body. And that they should feel each other's pain. And this is what I think I certainly felt as I was reading this book. This these challenging circumstances, which we're so deliberately and systematically sort of like secluded from knowing about or experiencing. It's only in sort of small civil society organizations like Cage or in the ivory tower of academia. I mean, as you were talking, I was just thinking about some of the main vehicles of culture in our societies, and film being perhaps the biggest of them. And the fact that far from this sort of situation being cherished as a form of resistance, it's films like Zero Dark 30 or you know, a whole bunch of war-obsessed films that come out of Hollywood celebrating the military-industrial complex, in partnership very explicitly with the State Department and with the Pentagon, so that they can use all the technologies, the latest, showcase the latest of American imperial strength. And so in a sense, you know, that resistance also, you know, needs to spread well beyond the academic space. And we have, you know, brothers and sisters doing that. I think both of you have been involved, and partly I assume that's why you've written this book, because it's not your typical academic book. But I'm also thinking about, you know, our friends such as the brown hijabi, I forget her, Zohaira, sorry, Suhaima, and various other people, sorry, who engage in this sort of space through culture. Loki is an excellent example with his raps about Palestine. And so, yeah, I just wanted to underline that reading a book like this is a devotional act as well, for Muslims in particular. Perhaps not so much for non-Muslims, but it can be seen as a type of meditative, you know, engagement with people that you will probably never meet or never have to interact with if you're a non-Muslim, because you know, being a Muslim, overtly Muslim in the public sphere, can be an act of resistance that can end you up in these sorts of contexts. May Allah protect us. But, you know, for those of us who have to end up suffering it, may Allah give us strength to confront that sort of situation. I wanted to ask a little bit about fiqh to Walaa specifically, because you've spoken to Muhammad al-Hassan al-Dado as well.
Yeah.
And I know that he's talked about some of these sorts of things from a fiqh perspective. I don't know if he's written about it or if he's done extensive treatments, but for a figure like that, like, how important is that fiqh dimension to being incarcerated?
So I interviewed Sheikh Dadu when I was working on my research on hunger strikes, and I asked him specifically about hunger strikes. I hadn't, at that point, I hadn't conceived of all of the other fiqhi questions, but they did come in. So the very first thing that he told me was that First of all, he made a joke. So I asked him, do you think the Islam is compatible with the modern carceral system? And then he said, there's nothing modern about what I experienced. This is some medieval stuff. This isn't modern at all. Um, but he noted that
Allah yahfazahu.
he was imprisoned for 3 years in Mauritania, and that he was coming at it from a place of understanding what it looks like from within. And he mentioned, so there were a couple of things that I teased out that were very, very interesting in terms of how we think about incarceration as Muslims. First of all, when I was asking him about the permissibility of hunger strikes and what are the sort of rulings and the caveats that go along with this, he mentioned that, and I asked him if it makes a difference if the prisoner incarcerated was a quote unquote political prisoner or someone who was incarcerated for a criminal offense. And he said, if someone ended up in prison and there is no recourse, there is no due process, and the system is unjust, then how can you define them in any way but a political prisoner? There is a political failure that led to them to be in that situation, and they, by definition, are a political prisoner. And he continued, and if the prisoner was in fact guilty of a crime, but suffered humiliation and strikes against his honor, his body, his wealth, he is allowed, or she is allowed, to basically defend themselves. He said that the scholars were divided. Some said that it was mustahab, some that it was something that is liked, and others said that it was wajib, and his opinion that it's your duty to defend yourself if you are attacked, even if you are someone who had committed a crime. And that was something that was really kind of a point of departure for me, because it's very easy to look at incarceration in terms of people that look like us, people that think like we do, and people who we believe are innocent, right? The people that imprison them don't believe the same things. They don't see them as themselves. They don't find them innocent. So how do we think of incarceration as a system? How do we think of rights of prisoners as a starting point? And that was something that he had mentioned. The other point that he discussed in our interview that was really fascinating to me, he said the act of imprisonment is like an act of warfare on three fronts. It's a religious war, it's a psychological war, and it's a physical war. It's a religious war in terms of being prevented from practicing your faith freely, and in terms it's a religious war. And by the way, there is an aspect that we didn't discuss in the book, but it's a question that scholars do debate. Someone who's incarcerated for a long time can, or for potentially the rest of their life, cannot physically go to Hajj. They cannot complete one of the 5 pillars of Islam. So what is the state's duty for that person? Another sheikh that I interviewed, a Shafi'i scholar, he said that it's the state's responsibility to secure the prisoners, if we do believe it in the structure of incarceration. It's the state's duty to to help them, facilitate them to go do Hajj, and to manage their safety and security and their return. What happens when you incarcerate a woman and they have a child, they're pregnant? Does that child then become a prisoner, or are they displaced from their mother? So there are things that are very, like, they're real contentious issues in terms of how is this a Sharia compliant institution. And I think when we talk about the nation state and the falters of the nation state, we tend to have two speeds, right? We have a radical unsettling of the etymology of the nation state, but we're also very modest in terms of what instruments of the nation state we want to dispel. And that's something that I guess is a tendency within like the fear of the Muslim mind to completely unsettle everything that is in existence. But there are big epistemic and big questions in relation to like violence that we need to rethink, and prisons are a primary point. Um, and I just want to add one last thing in terms of devotion and devotional practices. I think the one thing that Asim and I we spoke about in great lengths, we can't really sort of, these are stories, and the narratives of the prisoners will invariably impact the reader in different ways depending on who they are and uh, their personal experiences. But it's very, very important to us that if we are to take this as a devotional act, that the very notion of devotion becomes radically transformed, because there is a tendency, especially within Ramadan, to consume spiritual experiences, consume anecdotes, and sort of see people's traumas as a way to say, well, Alhamdulillah, my life is better. And that's not the point of it at all, right? The point is to realize that these are real human beings that are weak. They're not superhuman. And I really recommend everyone read Malika Shwaykh's article Against Resilience that she wrote in relation to the people in Gaza. The very idea of superhuman strength, the superhuman resilient strength of people under really dehumanizing situations, in of itself is dehumanizing. You don't have to, like, to actively dehumanize someone is not just to completely say that they're utterly unhuman. It's also to put them in a place of superhuman strength. And that's not fair, right? So what I hope is that we take this, and if we want to think of devotion as a category, that we completely rethink it, and move away from a kind of voyeurism type of approach to really see, well, how does our view of reality, of faith, of the world become unsettled by this? How do we aim to work to change the world in a way where this is no longer the reality that we have to sort of that our kids will inherit? So that these are things that are very, very central, that we move away from the consuming stories to actually thinking about human beings and how human beings face real human challenges.
I mean, just
Sorry.
please, Asim, go ahead.
No, I was going to add one other kind of anecdote to that, because like even the notion of what devotion means, you know, it really like gets subverted when you think about how the prisoners conceive of certain moments themselves. So, for example, one of the former prisoners that I interviewed, who was in Bagram, he wasn't in Guantanamo. He, when we were talking about hunger strikes, he was just like, "Oh, well, I was always against hunger strikes. I didn't agree with it. Why should I hurt my own body? I'd much rather hurt the guards." And so his way of doing it, you know, and some of those that he was with, was to kind of literally use their own feces, mix it up with some water and other stuff, and then splash the guards with it on a regular basis. And they saw this as a virtuous act, right? So, you know, when we're talking about like prison as a space of devotion, even like things that would be like an anathema to us in our everyday life,
Right.
you know, as a people that take our cleanliness very, very, very seriously, as being close to godliness, right?
Right.
To kind of think that like people are, you know, kind of literally putting their hands down their pants and, you know, kind of mixing their feces up into little cups and projectile throwing that at guards in order to humiliate them. For him, that was the higher ethic than hunger striking. he was just like, why should I hurt my own body? Like, I'm not going to do that, but I'm going to hurt them for sure, because they're the ones who have put me in this situation, and this is how I'm going to resist them. This is how I'm, effectively going to worship Allah in the kind of conflict that I have with these people who are trying to hurt me and harm me. So I found that anecdote particularly interesting, because the hunger strikes whole section of the book is really amazing, and you hear the stories of the way that people kind of, the difficulty they went through with it, but kind of the thought process that was involved in even getting to the stage of doing that. But this was a slightly different angle, which I found really interesting.
Is that anecdote in the book? I didn't get to that bit.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, okay. That's right. Yeah, it is.
I mean, at the end of the day, an act of resistance is very different. I mean, Muslims should have a capacious understanding of what devotion is, right? This is a holistic deen which incorporates, the Prophet ﷺ's engaging in just war as dirwatu sanam al-Islam, like the highest act of devotion in our tradition. And ostensibly, that could involve killing people. So it's an act which, under normal circumstances, is not just prohibited, but one of the worst sins possible. But situated as an act of defending the dispossessed, the weak, those who have been treated unjustly, it can become an act of worship. And so I think just, recognizing that these people are going to make judgment calls at times, and, they don't have recourse to the Fatwa Council of such and such a sort of great institution. And so they, it's an interesting, I can certainly see the legitimacy of someone making that sort of an argument, even if it's sort of maybe not something I would do myself. But but no, I mean, I think this is one.
But you never know, Osama. You never know what you do in that situation. That's the whole point. You just never know what you're going to do, and that's part of the book. That when you read yourself into it, you just don't know what you would do in the moment that they're in. Are you a guy who plucks? Are you a guy who doesn't? Are you a person who,
Yes.
When you don't know where you are, do you face east because you think that you're still in one part of the world, or do you face west in terms of your Qibla? And you have that bizarre situation where you had two Jama'as facing in two opposite directions in Guantanamo at the same time.
So, and beyond all of this, sometimes you struggle with the very notion of faith, right? That the idea, we know that Iman increases and decreases, but it's even beyond linear. People have real challenges as to what are the core tenets of my faith. What do I believe? Has God forgotten me? These are questions that people have to endure. And the thing is, we end the book with the end of prisons, but sometimes the real challenges occurs right after someone is released. These are when the challenges of their faith really begin to crystallize. So the stories are so complicated and they're so rich. So again, read it, but don't expect that it will somehow increase your sense of faith, because it'll challenge you. Read it for what it is. These are the stories of real human beings facing real challenges.
I mean, if I could perhaps sort of interject briefly. So I think it's certainly a challenge when you're a 13-year-old girl who's being thrown into prison, as you do, as you mentioned in one of the early anecdotes, and really being humiliated in these horrendous ways, and subject to torture. And I don't think at that age you can expect someone to be able to process that. But I think, when your physical body is being pushed to the limits at any age, the ability to sort of process that is something which is, again, I resort to the language of fiqh to a certain extent. Al-insanu ma'zur, a person becomes excused from, accountability under those sorts of circumstances. So I think, even at points where people come to question their fundamental sort of worldview, it's important to put that in a context. And especially if one believes in a merciful God, ultimately, who will recognize what human beings can and cannot endure. So yeah, I mean, I'm largely agreeing with your sort of comment, perhaps sort of adding a slight sort of an alternative reading to it, or to be honest, it's more or less in agreement with what you've said. I did want to, though, add on the point of devotion, that in some respects, we do need to. I mean, I would encourage people to read this sort of a book as a devotional act, but also to use the phrase you just used, Asim, the idea of reading oneself into the text. I found that inevitable as I was reading it. Like, you ask yourself, well, what on earth would I do in this sort of situation? And I think, for better or for worse, and this is in some respects, I would say, this is a sharaf which I would rather be without. As a Muslim in the context of the global war on terror, you are potentially, the system is built for you, shall we say. That global war on terror prison industrial complex is built for you. And perhaps there is a certain amount of security in numbers. We are almost 2 billion, and there aren't that many prison spaces, alhamdulillah. But but it's something just to be very mindful of and thoughtful about, that these are our brothers and sisters who are suffering, often just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as we know with people like Mazen Beg and others. Yeah, I mean, what did a 13-year-old do to deserve to be sort of strip searched in an Egyptian prison in the most humiliating of ways? So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to, give us the ability to, make a positive impact in these spaces. And I think the way in which you've contributed, I'm sure you will see it as, the least you could do. And, I think having this sort of a session is really the least someone like myself can do. But I think too few of us as Muslims living in countries where we have remarkable political freedom compared to so many of our own countries, or compared to the people who, I mean, I still can't get my head around the fact that that person was in the Charleston naval brig on US soil and the Constitution doesn't apply. Make it make sense. It doesn't. But perhaps I can ask you about that later, Asim. But yeah, I mean, like, I think we have a duty to make ourselves aware of this and make other people aware of this, and that's inshallah what you're doing with this book, inshallah. So I had, I guess, a question which is pertinent to the month we're in, and you've in many respects already answered this question, but let me blend it in with another question, and whoever wants to take it, please feel free. Maybe both of you want to comment on this, which is, we're in the month of Ramadan. We're also in the midst of one of the most vicious onslaughts against the Ummah in recent memory. It's done with such, I don't know, like wantonness and such, openness. You think of the Uyghurs and, estimated almost 2 million people, and that's all hidden. I mean, like, it doesn't need to be so flagrant, so, flouting one's ability to just murder on a scale which is, industrial doesn't really capture, with maybe 25,000 women and children killed so far of our Gazan brothers and sisters. And we're, having the comfort of our own sort of like context with our comfortable British passports, in the case of the three of us, being able to travel the world. If we want, we could go to Israel. And yet, what do we do as an ummah in this kind of context of dramatic disjuncture? And how do, I want you to think, I mean, as I was reading this book, I was just wondering, like, that the prison context is the tame version of it. Gaza is the violent, sort of unrestrained version of it, of the global war on terror. And I just wanted to make you maybe speak a little to those two dimensions, Ramadan and Gaza, with the book. It's a big question. It doesn't need to be addressed, at length or anything.
Sure. Walaa, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I think a couple of things come to mind. I think that the invisibility visibility sort of dimension of all of this is really interesting, and kind of interesting in a very scary way, because the question is it better to have all this sort of calamity, all of this incredible violence happen, and no one really knows about it? We hear whispers, but you have a significant portion of the Muslim community now denying that it happens, or is it better that it's all out in the open, but yet we're still shown day in and day again that we're completely helpless in all of this? So I don't know if you can compare the two, but what we can say is that if we think of sort of Israeli carceral technology. And I just want to bring it back to this. I think it's at the heart of all all of the questions that we raise, in terms of, you can read everything in snapshots, but the fact is all of these technologies are connected in very real ways, and the strategies are replicated from one place to another, even with supposed enemies. So, like, one very simple example, pretrial or administrative detention. That's the tool that the Israeli state uses in order to mass incarcerate Palestinians and keep them for God knows how long, right? People are held with secret evidence that they don't have access to, their lawyers don't have access to, and they're basically incommunicado for years on end. This is the tool that Egypt uses in its way to kind of keep people hidden, keep people from having access to a trial, no matter how much of a trial the trials are like farcical. But the fact is, people are held on pre-trial detentions for years on end, and they don't have access to the evidence that is against them. So the intelligence cooperation is very deep. But the question of prisoners and the Palestinian prisoners is at the heart of what's going on right now. And even not just in terms of state logics, but also in terms of how Palestinians within Israeli carceral control engage with one another, and even under these very torturous conditions, how it also is a generative space. I mean, the different factions of Palestinians, the different sort of groups talk to one another. That's the one space that they're actually able to talk to one another and sort of make reach understandings, agreements, that it's within the carceral space. The the fiqhi sort of plurality and the fiqhi principles that come out of Palestinian prisons are also very generative, and a lot of the ideas that the Egyptians reached, actually the precedents came from Palestine. I mean, one book on the fiqh of incarceration, on what a Muslim, from the perspective of the prisoner, not from the perspective of the state, because there are a lot of books on the fiqh of prisons from the perspective of what the state should do. But the only book that I found from the perspective of prisoners came out of Palestine. You have the issue of like smuggled sperm, and the fatwa councils in Palestine were working towards finding justifications and arguing for and against. So these are spaces that are very important, and they're very linked, and they're very present in these carceral experiences. So Gaza is very central.
Just to clarify, so smuggled sperm for insemination of spouses in order to have children, subhanAllah, because people are incarcerated and prevented from basically building families. Barakallahu feekum. Asim.
Yeah, I think we've kind of delved a little bit into more of a different space than the actual book itself. More into a little bit into theology here, because Walaa's made the point already about resilience not being used as a means of masking the violence of the state. We see Palestinians in Gaza, just the sheer volume of videos that you see of them saying Hasbunallah wa ni'mal wakil, right, over and over and over again. And you think, wow, how amazing, right, that they have so much fortitude. But that's for them.
Yeah.
In the moment that they're in. That is not for us.
Right.
In terms of our obligations and our responsibilities. And sometimes what happens with resilience narratives is that they become a demobilizing force in our lives as onlookers, because we believe, as Walaa has been mentioning before, that these people are superhuman. But what is going on with them, they are dealing with it in the way that they're dealing with it because they're on the ground, and we make no judgment as to their responses. And we try and support them as much as we can. But we're being tested in a completely different way for ourselves when we look at that scenario. And so, as we look from the outside, the question is always about, well, who are we in this moment? What resources and abilities have we been given, and what responsibilities do we have? And for those of us who live in the West, you mentioned the point about the passports. Is a fisherman in Somalia or a farmer in Afghanistan going to be asked the kind of questions that we're going to be asked about any of these types of issues? And so there is a larger question that looms above us when we think about oppression more generally, whether it's to do with prisons and prisoners, or whether it's to do with a live streamed genocide that we're seeing taking place right in front of us. And so, I think that the basic point is that with a book like this, bringing it back to the book, that like we've been saying all along, you're gonna read yourself into it in many different ways. There are aspects of it that are emblematic of wider struggles that we have, and we can talk about the conclusion to the book a little bit later, because I think that's significant in terms of those wider struggles. But there are also kind of these, individual kind of vignettes that are worth thinking about just for the sake of themselves, and how we might conceive of somebody in that situation, in that moment, in that time. And, is it possible for us to be, to see that person outside of what we're traditionally taught about them? So if we just take, for example, he's not in the book, but if we take, for example, David Hicks, who was the most famous, person to apostate within Guantanamo. And I say that very, very loosely, because the point being that a lot of the brothers who were around him, some people shunned him straight away. But there were many, like Mazam, who said, perhaps he's ghayr mukallaf, right? Perhaps he's not accountable for what he's saying and what he's doing. And so we need to hold ourselves back in these times of violence, in these extreme moments, from reaching to the easy answers that the fiqh usually provides for us, and see that these are human experiences. And I think that's really what this book is first and foremost about. And even when we're looking at it in terms of Gaza, if we extrapolate it then wider to that, then again, borrowing from Malika Shuaik's article, that we have to see these people as human beings, and not superhuman in some way, because they might fall down. And if they fall down, does that mean our aqidah falls down as well with it? Right? No, it doesn't. It means that we have to see it for what it is and understand it in its moment, and try and give whatever support we can for it.
If I can sort of just add a reflection on what you've mentioned, both of you actually, but the idea that picking out the easy fiqh answers, and I think in a sense it's a reflection of the superficiality of our understanding of our own religion. Sometimes when we sort of pick out these, sort of the obvious algorithmic response to A plus B equals C. Whereas the circumstances we live in this kind of post-colonial condition, and I use post-colonial kind of like, we are in a colonial condition very transparently in a place like Israel. And the fact that is the training ground for, our states, our so-called post-colonial states, when it comes to incarceration. Egypt right now being, completely sort of a partner of Israel in maintaining the blockade that is creating starvation for the entirety of the population of Gaza. Just as a reminder that, we do need to think about these as quite exceptional circumstances, exceptional times, and from the average Muslim's reading of a person in suffering has to be characterized by mercy, always. But when it comes to, the zalim or the oppressor or the tyrant, there we should be asking the real questions of ourselves. And I think, you just mentioned, like, both of you mentioned Malaka Shwaikh's sort of article and kind of admiration for resilience that can become perverse if not channeled in the right sort of way. Because the real question, it brought to mind the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, where someone comes to him and says, Ya Rasulullah, mata sa'a? When's the hour? And there's a kind of like morbid curiosity about it. And the Prophet's answer isn't like, oh, this is when it is, or look at these signs, etc. He's saying, what have you prepared for it? Yeah. Right? What's your response to it? What are you doing about it? Right? And this is where, in a sense, I hope we're all, to a certain extent, disrupting the typical academic kind of like role of just looking at the world and writing down and engaging in really fascinating reflections on these. No, we're actually, I hope, trying to get ourselves to think, well, what's my role here? And how can I get my community? And, that community is multi-layered. It includes, for example, the British public. It includes right-thinking people around the world to do something to change this horrendous situation. And I think, I'm really happy to say that there are almost 100 people on this. There's literally 98 people watching this right now. So including us, it's over 100 people. And in some respects, the shifts that we're trying to encourage are shifts in thinking. The norms of the nation state are ultimately norms that we hold in our minds. They're all socially constructed. And we need to have more of these conversations to disrupt those sorts of in a sense, those sorts of jahili norms, if I may use that expression. And in a sense, I want to use that as a segue to kind of give you the floor to talk about the conclusion.
You really watch out. Gove's going to be on to you if you do that.
Actually, I've got another story about that for another time, inshallah. But yeah, I want maybe to give you both the floor to reflect on the conclusion, inshallah, of the. I'm conscious of your time zone in particular, Asim Bey, but
we still got a bit, so
Okay, so inshallah, I'm happy to. Also, inshallah, there are some people putting in comments. We might be able to address them in a bit, but just wanted to get sort of some thoughts on the conclusion, which unfortunately I've not gotten to yet, but you just mentioned was an important part of this book. Who wants?
Go ahead.
Okay. So we did something a bit different with the conclusion, which was, the book is about the entirety of the experiences, from Salah all the way through to resistance. So prayer to resistance. We talk about, wudu, we talk about dreams, all of this kind of stuff. And it would have been easy just to kind of write a concluding chapter just to say, oh, this is how they experience this and this I experience this. But I think, if most people are reading the book, they'll have their own summaries of those chapters as they're reading through them. So what we did instead is that we took a novel by the Egyptian psychotherapist, I think, Basma Abdelaziz. Yeah, her novel, The Queue. And we reflected on it in relation to, what the national security state is. And The Queue is an amazing novel because it has this almost prescient, linguistically prophetic quality about it, because she basically ends up writing a novel that will go on to describe Rabaa before Rabaa takes place. Right? It's unbelievable. Some of the parallels are just are mind-boggling, And really what we wanted to focus on was this idea of the national security state as a deified body. And the reason why we felt that was important is because the nation state, and especially the national security nation state, it has to embody all goodness to itself. You know, Dalal Asad in secular translations, he talks about the fact that because the modern nation state has to be the final arbiter of all that is good, it has to be the determiner of what is good in the world, it has to militarize itself against its own population, right? And that notion is quite profound, because at no point can you trust your population to do what is right, because there is nothing that the state assumes is between the individual and something else that will dictate their behavior. So in this case, for us as Muslims, practicing Muslims, it would be Allah that would regulate our behavior, right? So the trust for, in a decentralized way, would be that, you know, our population, they're cognizant of God, and they will do what is right the majority of the time. But the modern national security nation state can never allow that assumption to take place. It has to militarize itself. But what it does in the process of that is that it deifies itself as well. And it does that by regulating all aspects of religion. So it becomes the determiner of what correct religion is, of the way that religion is used. And so when, as we cite at the beginning of the book, as an epigraph in one of the interviews that Walaa did, when they say as an interrogator, we say kun fayakun, right, an ultimate act of blasphemy, they actually mean it, because they've come to believe it about themselves, that they have this deified estate. And it's very pharaonic in many ways. You know, if you think about Surah Naziyat, you know, Anna Rabbukum al-A'la, you know, I am your Lord Most High. It's these ideas that perpetuate, but it's not just in Egypt though. And that's the thing. It's so fascinating that it happens in the US as well, where the US becomes the arbiter of what is correct Islamic practice. So we'll assassinate Osama bin Laden and we'll dump his body in the sea, because we can tell you, as a matter of fact, that dumping his body in the sea is correct Islamic, is according to the Sharia, right? Because we were worried that they were going to turn his body into a shrine, even though the vast majority of people that followed him don't believe in shrines in the first place. Like, you got like all of these bizarre elements. But this is not something new. It's not something that is just limited to the war on terror. And so in the introduction, we even talk about like the history of pathologization and criminalization within the US in particular, and of course throughout the whole history of Egypt. But we give the example of the way that the Nation of Islam tried to gain their prisoner rights inside prison, whether it was access to the Quran, whether it was being able to pray, you know, have their own study circles, whatever it might be. But the Nation of Islam were attempting to live a fulfilled religious life inside prison. And what did the state do? The state said, well, we've got this whole Ahmadi community here who are really great Muslims. We're going to just send them into the prison and they can be your chaplains and you can follow their version of the faith, because that's the version of the faith that we think is really great and that we like. So again, what they're doing is that they are bordering the constraints of what legitimate religion is permitted to look like. And what it's never, of course, permitted to look like is one that will resist the norms of the state deifying itself in some way, or having the final word on what permitted religion looks like, or being able to limit their religion in any way. So that is where the real contestation is taking place. It's not actually just simply at the level of they're using these policies in order to harm these Muslims. If we zoom out, what we're seeing, that the real contestation is how the state conceives of itself as a deified being. And that for me is very, very interesting. And, you know, what I mentioned, you know, people like Osama al-Azhari, you know, you mentioned Ali Gum'a, you know, all of these people who play a role. So even Ali Gum'a, right, when we talk about, you know, religious violence, there's a man who calls a whole group of protesters Kalab an-Nar, the dogs of the hellfire. Why? because it gives religious sanction to murder. When the executions take place against political prisoners in Egypt, as Walaa writes about in her chapters, what is required at the end of the process of these political crimes? A seal from the Grand Mufti of al-Azhar that validates the execution. It is the final religious symbolism that this execution is a Sharia compliant execution, that this is a halal execution, right? And that is what the state does. It centralizes the entirety of religion to itself and says that we will reconfigure religion in our own being, in the way that we choose and decide. And that's what's happening in these states, whether they're the US, who then tell us what Islam is supposed to be in these environments, or whether it's Egypt. And I don't know if Walaa wants to add something to that.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, just a small point. So the Mufti, the Grand Mufti, is the one who ratifies the executions. Shawqi Alam, who is a regular at the Peace Forum, just to connect back to some earlier work we did. But yeah, I think it's interesting how we think about the boundaries of the state itself being deified and the instrumentalization of Islam in order to legitimize this deification. And yeah, I mean, I think this video is on YouTube when the young man was sent to execution, and he said, if you were tortured in the way that I was tortured, or if you were I was electrocuted with enough electricity to light the whole of Egypt. But before he actually said these phrases, the judge starts off with Quranic injunctions and verses in order to preempt the judgment that he reached, And this isn't just in the case of Egypt. When we talk about hunger strikes and the arguments against hunger strikes, the chaplains use in the U.S. context, they use the Quran in order to argue against it, which could be, a valid religious argument if it wasn't the fact that when they don't work, the solitary confinement comes in, torture comes in, force feeding comes in. So these become instruments of this very state. And I think what is beyond this, and what I hope people sort of ponder after they read the book, is two main things, other than the actual sort of anecdotes and stories that we relay. But first of all, that the boundaries between the carceral and the non-carceral are not as solid as we believe them to be. Just because a population is made invisible doesn't mean that the realities that they live don't have real impact in the world that we live in. And their stories, when a prisoner is sentenced, they are punished, but also their parents are punished. The children they're yet to have are punished. You have whole communities impacted and affected by incarceration. And again, it's not just political incarceration. And this is, again, I want to reiterate what like Sheikh Dadu said. If the whole system is geared towards you ending up in that place, and you will inevitably end up in that place, then by definition, it's a political failure. You're a political prisoner. Even if you've committed a crime, we need to think about punishment in its totality, because the fact that the system is set up in the way that it is makes it feasible for people who are incarcerated for their beliefs or their ideals to be then put in that place. I think one thing I mentioned in a footnote, and I wasn't able to actually talk about to the extent that I would like to have in the book, was that distinction between political and criminal incarceration. so within the case of Guantanamo, it's seemingly a little bit more straightforward, even though it's not. But I want to just show how much of a moving market is in Egypt. If you are someone that comes from a working class background, and the police, the officer, your local officer, tries to recruit you to become an informant, and you refuse, the very, very simple solution is that you will be imprisoned for a petty crime, a drug offense, a sex crime. It's very, very easy. And in that case, you'll be charged as it'll be a criminal offense, right? In the same sense, political offenses are someone who might have committed something that could be categorized as criminal, but because they rubbed someone off the wrong way, they could be charged as having joined a terrorist organization, which is a criminal, which is a political offense, right? So the state demarcates the level of criminality and thereby judges you through these demarcations. But these demarcations are so fluid, and particularly within the context of mixed prisons, where there are people who are quote unquote political prisoners, quote unquote people who are incarcerated for criminal offenses. The really and this is one of the really interesting things that came out of my interviews, the way that people who are incarcerated for criminal offenses interact with people who have been incarcerated for political offenses. I mean, in some cases, they're both Muslims, right? How do they deal with the Quran? How do they deal with the story of Yusuf as someone who felt like the whole system was set up against them their whole lives, and they're being put in this place, and they want to leave? So these are things, again, I want us to think a little bit more deeply about in terms of just how we think about the system and how it's run and how it continues to perpetuate itself.
Jazakumullah khairan. Really appreciate your time. This has really been a very rich discussion on an even richer text that you've both put together, built on in some respects, the suffering of, at this point, probably tens of thousands of people globally. And I just want to reiterate to everyone that there's 106 people watching right now, and I want you all to try to get your hand on this book, read it, reflect in the way that the authors have very kindly given their time for the last hour and a half to think about this as, on some level, a call to action, a call to reflect on certain things that we simply take for granted, and to recognize actually the implications are there for all of us as Muslims. Maybe I'll close just with this one point before I hand over the floor to you guys with any final comments. But you think about the relatively recent exclusion or stripping of British citizenship of certain people. This is part of the global security architecture of the global war on terror. And essentially what that has done is created a two-tiered citizenship system in the UK for the only people who are really at risk here are anyone who is Muslim, which is about 4 million people in the British Isles. That's a significant sort of act of quasi-disenfranchisement suffered by a massive section of the population who are disposable in that sense. And so there are implications here that we need to reflect on, that we live, even if we don't necessarily directly come into these sorts of circumstances, for the most part. And so, again, I can only encourage people to read the book. I really want to thank you both for your time, for writing the book, which would have been something of a painful experience in and of itself, I think, but also profoundly sort of a profound experience of spiritual growth, I'm sure. But if either of you want to say anything before I conclude, inshallah.
Please, Walaa.
I'm okay, thank you.
Well, yeah, no, alhamdulillah. I think we covered a lot. Jazakallah khairan.
Jazakallah khairan. As people head towards iftar, a lot later for you, Walaa, than the rest of us, Please remember the people of Gaza in your prayers. Please remember the people who are incarcerated unjustly in their tens of thousands around the world in your prayers. And, please read this book when you get the chance, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
السلام ورحمة الله وبركاته.